Good morning. Again, we say good morning. It is wonderful to see everybody that is here today to help us as we celebrate the Denver Metro Fair Housing, but even greater than that, that we celebrate the National Fair Housing Month. It is the 65th anniversary of the passage of Colorado's first in the nation state level Fair Housing Act. This would be a good time for you to put your hands together and celebrate Fair Housing Month. We also want to put our hands together and thank our guitarist, our celebratory guitarist, Gregory Goodlow. Why don't we celebrate him as well? And again, it is wonderful to have all of you that are here today. It's a very robust crowd, smiling faces, smiling faces, smiling faces. One more time, smiling faces. All righty, I appreciate again the fact that you all are here. The Denver Metro Housing Center works to eliminate housing discrimination and promotes housing choice for all people through education, advocacy, enforcement, and it is a place that we stand in the gap for those that oftentimes are underappreciated, underserved, not necessarily diminished, but sometimes want to be forgotten. And so we want to make sure that no one is forgotten. In other terms, that no one is left behind. If you don't mind, there's just a little housekeeping. We're asking that you put your phone on vibrate. And if you are challenged with the ability to put your phone on vibrate, just look at someone younger than yourself, hand it to them, and they will make sure that it gets done. It's a full program today, so there are no breaks. The restrooms are in the back of the hall, exit door, and just take a right. We want to thank all of our sponsors, the HUD grant funding, and all the companies that are listed on your program. Please refer to that so that you will have and you can get those that are helping us to make this event successful. We want to thank Michael Ramsey, the Director of External Affairs at MSU, for the many, many ways he has helped to assure the success of today's conference. We could not do this without MSU. We thank them for their partnership. We thank them for the consideration and time. We thank them for the skill set, the staff that they've allowed to be a part of this day. Important notes: 2 QR codes are on the right side of your program. They are in your tote bag. On the upper QR code are the full bios of all of today's speakers. The lower QR code, your opportunity to contribute. Become a fair housing ally. Give whatever you can to support our work. We can't make it on the grant support alone. We all struggle for those same dollars. We all struggle in that nonprofit sector for funding. We are continually trying to raise money. We thank you in advance for any considerations that you will make towards the fair housing. There is a racial study bill, SB 24-053. In the line with our theme today, reversing segregation, this bill creates a commission that will allow us to determine government actions and policies that are attributed to the impacts of past and current discrimination. Please complete the yellow evaluation form at your seat before you leave. Yes, the battle does go on. Today, MSU, we are so happy to bring your own Mike Ramsey, who is the Director of External Affairs, who is standing in for James Miha, who right now is not well, a little under the weather. We say a little silent prayer for him, for his recovery. But put your hands together now for Mike Ramsey.
Hey, morning, everyone. Morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Am I on? All right, cool. Thank you. All right, so just to let you know, my name is Mike Ramsey, Director of External Affairs. This is Zon. This is my child. It is Bring Your Kid to Work Day today. So we're going to be out and about on this campus, but I had to get Zon in the game today. Say hi, Zon, if you can. So just want to say thanks, y'all. Thanks for filling the room. Thanks for being here. This was actually the first event I was connected to last year when I first started my job, and to see it, full and still rocking this year is absolutely beautiful. So I just want to say thank you for being on campus. Um, it's powerful to me because this is about education, right? Like this whole thing is about education. As my dad used to say, education is the key, the key to progress, the key to advocacy. And so we are very proud to be here in support of that and to support Denver Metro Fair Housing, to support John Paul and Veronica. I love this kind of connection. This is what partnerships are about with universities and nonprofits and other kind of businesses and organizations. So we're just proud to be here, happy to be here. I hope you learn well. I hope you connect because learning isn't much without action too. So I hope you can get those connections and create some action after this as well. So thank you, and man, learn well today, y'all. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mike Ramsey. Appreciate you again. Um, what a courageous father to handle what he's handling and to bring his daughter to work with him today. My hat is off. I applaud you, sir. Fantastic and phenomenal. Our keynote speaker, Cashauna Hill, was recently named executive director of the Redress movement. Her bio also is in your program. I don't want to take any time away from Cashauna at all. I want her to have the floor and I want her to be free. I want her to feel that she not only can own this stage, but she can also speak her truth. Why don't we celebrate right now Cashauna Hill? Put your hands together for our keynote speaker.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, and thank you so much for being here. I'm very excited and honored to be here today, and I do want to thank everyone at the Denver Metro Fair Housing Center for the invitation to share a little bit with you today about the work of the redress movement and also about what we can do in communities across the country to take action that addresses residential segregation, because it is an ongoing and persistent problem in communities all across the country. So I'm going to first start by telling you a little bit about myself and a little bit about the history of the redress movement. So I have a long background as a civil rights and fair housing attorney. I have come to this work because of the very clear ways in which the mission of the redress movement has become apparent to me, right? And so, to be very clear, the Redress Movement is a new national nonprofit. We've only been around for 2 years, and I'm going to say that one more time, just 2 years, because typically in these conversations, there's always lots, right, that people want to talk about in their communities. Now, I don't have the added pressure today of being in a community where there is not a Redress Movement chapter, because when I am in those communities, then I am very often asked, well, when are you coming to my community and what do we have to do to get you here? And so the 2 years piece is very important to underscore, right? We're still a very brand new organization. And I also want to assure you that you haven't missed anything, because I often get that question. Well, how come I didn't know about this? I can't believe it. You haven't missed anything. We just got here. So the Redress Movement was established and began working in 2022, and it was established as a direct result of the response to the book, The Color of Law. Many of you may be familiar with that book, which was published in 2017 and written by Richard Rothstein. The Color of Law takes a look at and describes the historical actions of the federal government in conjunction with the real estate industry and the roles they played in seeding and then perpetuating residential segregation all across the country. And so, given that history, at the Redress Movement, we envision a country where our zip code no longer predetermines our life chances, where every neighborhood has plenty of resources for us and our children, and where the opportunity to choose where we live or how we choose is not limited by bad policy, bad economics, or bad actors. Our mission is that the Redress movement is committed to leading a multiracial movement that empowers communities to take direct action to redress residential segregation. In doing that, we work together in partnership with local communities to discuss, address, and repair the harms caused by intentional policies to segregate communities. We do our work through educating, mobilizing, shifting the narrative, and winning redress victories. And so to be very clear, our starting point is housing, but we are very clear and understand the ways in which our historical actions as they relate to discriminatory housing policies and practices continue to impact the communities in which we live today. It always feels very important to start here with a definition at the outset. What does the term redress mean to us within the movement? So we think about redress as present action to reverse and remedy ongoing segregation. And so I really want to lift up the word remedy, right? To be very clear, this country's history of racial discrimination when it comes to housing policy has never been fully discussed and has certainly never been addressed fully in any real comprehensive way. And so the goal of the redress movement is not only to provide that educational context so that folks are clear about how communities came to look the way that they do, but we also want to ensure, right, that as we move forward, our communities look different and there are remedies also provided, right, for the harms linked to residential segregation. I also want to call your attention to what is here on the screen. And this is a photo of Charlotte, North Carolina's redlining map. Now, many of you may know this, but redlining maps for most communities all across the country are readily available on the internet. And if you haven't had a chance to look at Denver's redlining map, I would absolutely encourage you to do so. What are redlining maps? I'm going to give a very quick history of what redlining is, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the historical drivers of residential segregation. But for those who may be unfamiliar with the concept, redlining refers to decisions that were made by the Homeowners Loan Corporation with the federal government in the 1930s and 1940s as the United States government was thinking through how to prevent another Great Depression, right? Because during this time, we were just coming out of that catastrophic event. And prior to that time, the majority of Americans who owned homes had to be very wealthy, right? They had to have a lot of cash in which they were able to go in and purchase a home and live there. Typically speaking, prior to the federal government's investment and interest in home loans and the mortgage industry, there really hadn't been much of a history of federally backed loans and mortgages. And so after the Great Depression, the federal government felt it very important to ensure that white Americans were set up such that they wouldn't suffer that level of catastrophic economic harm again. And the federal government decided to get into the business of subsidizing mortgages for white American families, right? And providing this opportunity for the wealth building that home ownership could provide. Now, it's incredibly important to note that where loans would be made and the people who would have access to those loans was decided by these redlining maps. And so I'm always underscoring that white Americans were enriched, right, and given opportunities through this program. The very clear guidelines of the Housing Administration as well as the HOLC made it clear that the federal government would not support or back or underwrite loans in communities that were deemed hazardous according to these maps. And so which communities were deemed hazardous and how did we know that they were deemed that way? The communities that were deemed hazardous were colored in red on these maps, right? Red means stop. And the communities that the Homeowners Loan Corporation decided were the most desirable, they were colored in green on the map, right? Green for go is how we can tend to think about this. And so what happened was as folks in the real estate industry went out into communities that had the presence, right, of people of color, those communities were automatically deemed hazardous. They were redlined, and I want to be very clear that this had nothing to do with the conditions of the neighborhood. The very presence of Black or brown or indigenous folks right in that community made it such that the federal government decided that that was not a safe place to invest in. But what really was decided was that these people and these communities were not worth investment. And so I want to be very clear, right, about the lack of value that from the very beginning of our modern housing system, the federal government and other actors have placed, right, on the lives of Black and brown people. Now, to be clear, to be even more clear, monetary valuations, right, have certainly been made about the lives of African Americans since we were brought to this place that wasn't even the United States yet 400 years ago. And so we already have a well-documented history of placing dollar values, right, on the worth of African American folks. And when we think about the formation of these redlining maps, what we did was take that valuation and move it into the housing space. I also want to connect that we continue to see this devaluation of Black and brown lives as it relates from everything to interactions with the police, right, to the lower home values that Black and brown families will have or that we'll find in communities of color. And so the federal government, right, continued, right, to implement this widespread devaluation in communities across the country. Now, this might not come as any surprise, but I'll share anyway, that in most communities across the country, when you line up these redlining maps, again, that are widely available on the internet, when you line them up with residential segregation, what you find is that the trends remain the same. These same communities that were redlined in the 1930s and 40s are the communities where, if you were in a community that was green, these are the same communities where you find the highest amounts of exclusionary zoning, right? You find the least amount of access, you find the highest incomes, the longest life expectancies. And conversely, when we look at the neighborhoods that were redlined, what we know is that those communities are largely still today communities of color. They are communities that have lower levels of income. These are communities that, as we should be clear about, these were communities that were intentionally starved of investment and choked off from opportunity. And so many of the outcomes that we continue to see today align with that disinvestment. These are communities that are going to have less access to jobs, to healthcare, to fresh food and healthy produce. In looking at redlining maps and comparing outcomes in New Orleans, which is where I have lived and been doing this work for about 15 years now, it's clear that the communities in New Orleans that were redlined, those are the communities where the highest rates of babies are born at a low birth rate. And those are also the same communities where we see the highest rates of housing choice voucher usage, right? The other communities that experience more opportunities and that are more well-resourced, those communities are largely off limits to low-income voucher holders. And then lastly, I want to say that in New Orleans, something that we were able to uncover there is also that the communities that were redlined are also home to the communities where children witness the highest rates of gun violence. And so the impacts can't be overstated, right? The legacy of this harmful decision making continues to play out over and over again. All of this continued to lead to disparate outcomes. And when the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, the goal, right, was to begin to offer some sort of remedy for the rampant discrimination and the lack of opportunity that was seen in communities of color. And so what the Fair Housing Act does, it was passed in 1968, it makes individual acts of housing discrimination illegal. And I would guess that that is actually something that most people here are familiar with. And I'll also say that when we think about the Fair Housing Act and when it comes up in conversation or when policymakers are focused on the idea of fair housing, this is where the conversation tends to stop, right? And I would also argue that that fits in very well with the ways in which across the United States race is discussed, right? We want to be able to pick out that bad actor We want to be able to say, this landlord wouldn't rent to someone because they were African American, or this person is racist. Instead, right, of taking a look at the systems that produce those outcomes. And there is also a very, very clear mandate in the Federal Fair Housing Act that requires local governments to actually address the legacy of discriminatory housing policies and work to create open, integrated communities. That mandate is known as affirmatively furthering fair housing. And this is the harder part to get to, right? Because even those of us who like to think about ourselves as being on the side of justice, it becomes harder sometimes, right, to think about the ways in which we need to change our lives to ensure that this country is living up to what we say we want to be and the values that we say we have. And so the harder thing about this duty to affirmatively further fair housing is that it requires us, right, to consider the possibility that if we, for instance, are white, we may need to live, right, or we may need to live next to people of color. We may need to be open to that idea, right? Being open to the idea of sending our children to public school. These two things, right, are really the last bastion of continued opportunity hoarding as well as perpetuation of disparate outcomes. And so we have to get comfortable with those truths. We have to get comfortable that it's not just enough, right, to show up here, but that we also need to be making sure that in our lives we are living in a way that aligns with our values. And so I would argue, and at the Redress movement, we do our work based on this understanding, right, that in addition to being clear about the bad actors that are out there, we also have to take a look at the systems and behaviors as a whole that continue to perpetuate these disparate outcomes. Lastly, as I prepare to tell you a little bit more about the Redress movement's work, I want to mention a little bit about the history of the passage of the Fair Housing Act. As you all heard during the introductory comments, the Fair Housing Act was passed in April 1968, and that's why we celebrate April as Fair Housing Month. Some of you may not be familiar with the fact that the Fair Housing Act was actually signed into law on April 11th, 1968. Now, I don't know if this is still being taught in high school history classes. It was a long time since I was in high school. But when I was in school, I didn't learn much else about Black folks' contribution to this history, or to this country. But what I did know was that Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated on April 4th, 1968. The Fair Housing Act was signed into law only 7 days. It was passed by Congress and signed by the president 7 days after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. Now, if you have any familiarity with our current political system, can you imagine a law of this magnitude being passed by this United States Congress and signed by the president within 7 days? That certainly has not happened in my lifetime, and I've been around for quite a while. What was the reason, right? What was the impetus for getting the law through Congress that quickly? Well, I'll tell you. Dr. King had been working for many years, right, in conjunction with organizers and communities all across the country in support of what were then known as open housing laws. And the idea, right, was really this affirmatively furthering fair housing. Dr. King was very clear that our past history of discriminatory housing policy continued to impact communities of ongoing inequities in the country. And so what Dr. King was doing was working with communities to change our system and structure around housing and to get a federal open housing law passed. After his assassination, communities were on fire. There were also lots of folks who were clear, right, that we needed to do something about the place people in communities and then subject them to, militarized police surveillance, right? And that something needed to change. I'll also note that Dr. King was assassinated after previous uprisings in the country, and a body commissioned by the federal government, the Kerner Commission, had already recommended that Congress take steps to bring opportunity to neighborhoods that were choked off by disinvestment and to do work to open up communities that were exclusionary. Those warnings went largely unheeded, and many of the warnings presented in that report are still very relevant today. But after communities were upset with Dr. King's assassination, there really was nothing left to do other than to take action. And so that's how we got the passage of the 1968 Fair Housing Act, which was the last of the major civil rights laws passed in this country. And so as we move forward and think about the work of the redress movement, how you can engage and what you can do to work on reversing segregation, I want us to remember the power of organizing and also the power of what people who are righteously angry can do. So now for a little bit more about the redress movement. We work in a variety of ways. As I mentioned, we create educational offerings that are designed to inform communities about hyperlocal histories and the impacts of segregation. We do organizing work. Our organizers on the ground work as part of a widespread movement for social change, leveraging Redress's own original research to help fill knowledge gaps and convening groups in the housing space to build a unified front and ultimately to build power. We also have a digital organizing team that mobilizes interested groups and individuals all over the country to build solidarity in support of the Redress movement's mission and work. We're currently working in 3 cities across the country, including here in Denver, and the Redress movement's senior campaign organizer for Denver is here, Kevin Patterson. I know that, yes, we enjoy Kevin, please. Kevin is absolutely the best, and I know that many of you in this room have had an opportunity to work with them during the time that the Redress movement has been organizing here. Now, I am going to leave much of the local work to Kevin, but again, we'll provide you all with an overview of the ways in which we work and the opportunities to engage in communities. So we're also working in Charlotte, North Carolina, as well as in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. As we move forward with the work that we do, I want to share a little bit about some of the educational materials and resources that we have put together. All of these resources are available on our website, redressmovement.org, and so I'll zoom through them and not spend very much time because you do have the ability to access all of these materials. I also want to note that the Redress movement's research is original. It is data-based research and analysis as well as archival research. And so we use these skills to create policy briefs that dive into contemporary issues that derive from racial segregation. As I mentioned, we also create local histories of segregation. We've created a citizen's guide that is designed to explain segregation both conceptually and as a real phenomenon that can be measured and researched. I think that's important to note, right? There are actually things like lost dollars, lost time that we can calculate, right? That we are impacted by as a result of residential segregation and discriminatory housing policy. We also have created a curriculum and vocabulary resource that compiled popular resources and common terms to help folks engaging with this work to bridge gaps in knowledge and to learn the language circulating in housing justice spaces today. We also conduct regular webinars. Our next webinar is coming up on May 1st and features a conversation on the links between segregation and environmental justice and climate change advocacy and organizing. I lastly want to note that the redress roundtables are an important part of our work and are a very critical feature in all of the cities in which we are currently working. The redress roundtables are where we convene partners and stakeholders in our 3 respective cities to document the history of segregation and start to devise campaigns for redress. So I'm guessing that there might be some folks in here who are members of the Denver Redress Roundtable. If so, thank you so much. If not, please connect with Kevin because we're always looking for new additions. These roundtables are really critical, right? Because the work that we are doing is driven by the needs of each community that we're working in partnership with. And so we have a wide variety of stakeholders at the redress roundtables who are driving not only the work that needs to happen, but are also helping us to figure out what campaigns will exactly get us to where we want to be in those communities. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about some historical framing and some of the common drivers of housing discrimination and segregation across the country. Remember, we talked a little bit about the Fair Housing Act and what was going on, as well as the system of redlining. And so you see that I have messed up the numbering here, and I did not catch that. That is I apologize for that. These are all number 1 in terms of importance, though. So I actually am going to say that this numbering might work. And so things like exclusionary zoning, right? Making sure that communities don't have a variety of housing types, right? And ensuring that communities are only available for single family home building. That is a huge driver and perpetuator of segregation all across the country. The overwhelming majority of cities in the United States have a majority, right, of their land reserved strictly for single family home zoning. And so given the homeownership gap in this country, if a community is only available to people who have the ability to purchase or rent a single family home, given the gap in homeownership as well as the gap in income, that goes a long way to ensuring, right, that large swaths of people of color will not have access to that community. Restrictive covenants, prior to being outlawed by the United States Supreme Court, were a big driver of the perpetuation of segregation. Many early developers and even those who were not early, going until the 1990s and 2000s, people have even discovered, right, that restrictive covenants were encumbering their properties. And these covenants are agreements that no person who is non-white will ever be able to live in or own that home. After The Color of Law was published, there's been a lot of movement around the country of folks taking a look at the deed to their home and finding that, in fact, some restrictive covenants are still on the books. We've already talked about redlining, so I'll move on. Racial discrimination by real estate agents continued to drive segregation and is a problem, as the folks at Denver Metro Housing Center know. Discrimination by real estate agents, primarily in the form of things like steering, it's still a problem across communities. Urban renewal and highway construction. I know that you all are very familiar with that history here in Denver, and what we know is that in communities all across the country, neighborhoods that were predominantly African American were significantly impacted by these urban renewal projects where the federal government would usually cite the need to build a highway or expand a highway and would then remove people, right, from their homes and from their communities for a very, very, very minimal amount of money. And then we certainly cannot, right, overlook that violence, right, has continued to be a driver of the current housing system and how we got to where we are. I also want to note that there's an overarching theme, right, in the way that some of this plays out, where people who have the resources, the weapons, and are willing to resort to violence, right, are really seeking to control the spaces that the rest of us have access to. And I would argue, as we think about people, right, having their communities intentionally starved of investment, again, going back to the redlining maps, and then we continue to see as gentrification fuels displacement in communities of country all across in communities of color all across the country, we continue to see, right, movement along the same path that I would argue started, right, with when our indigenous family members were dispossessed of their lands, right, before the United States was founded. And so we have had hundreds of years to figure this system out, but we've continued to operate in the same way that people who have resources, who have power, will then work to determine and decide where and how the rest of us live. So, in terms of the work that we're doing across the country, and I'm going to wrap this up so that we do have time for a few questions before the next panel. Here in Denver, and again, Kevin will do a fantastic job to speaking to this. The legislative session has been underway, and so we've been working to, in coalition, to support the reining in of abusive and inequitable practices of homeowners associations, particularly as they relate to foreclosures. I have often shared that in my 20 years of law practice, I had never had any reason to know that there are 12 states across the country where homeowners associations have the ability to foreclose on homeowners. Now, as you all live in one of those states, I'm sure you are familiar with that. But what we know, right, is that there is certainly a danger of disproportionate application of this power to foreclose against communities of color. There's also particularly a concern about foreclosure being used disproportionately against families of color in communities that are diversifying as people of color move out of, right, city neighborhoods that they have been displaced from due to gentrification. And as they move into some of these suburban communities that were initially home to white people who were fleeing, right, city neighborhoods, as those suburban communities now become more racially diverse, there's concern that the policies of the homeowners associations will disproportionately impact those families of color that are moving into what were previously majority white neighborhoods. Also, fighting for cause eviction protections has been critically important to the work that we are doing here in Denver. Kevin will share these updates, I'm sure, but we're so happy to know that the bill limiting the foreclosure powers of metro districts was passed and signed by the governor, and then those for-cause tenant protections have also advanced as well. So congratulations to you all. Great job getting that done. That's very exciting. In Charlotte, we are working on community education efforts, also countering the rise of corporate landlords, and then identifying remedies for African American families displaced by urban renewal policies. And then also there's some movement there around repudiating racially restrictive covenants that homeowners may find. In Milwaukee, there is huge concern around the lack of access to suburban communities that people of color living in Milwaukee currently have. Milwaukee is a community that is quite racially diverse, despite what many of us might think about Wisconsin at first glance. And what we know is that the areas surrounding the city of Milwaukee are predominantly white. And there are a lot of policies and practices at play that really limit the access that people of color living in Milwaukee have to the surrounding suburban communities in the county. And so there, with the support and the help, right, of the Redress Roundtable and all of their hard work, we have been able to move forward with having the County Board of Supervisors pass an ordinance that authorizes the creation of a housing committee. Now, this had been a multi-year effort in Milwaukee that failed several times. The redress movement was able to work in partnership with community members who wanted to see that goal met, and just last month, we accomplished it. The Housing Committee in Milwaukee will be comprised primarily of residents of the community and not by politicians, and they will have real authority to address the lack of city-county mobility that currently exists for residents of color in Milwaukee. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what kinds of things can redress look like, and then we will have a few moments for questions. What can redress look like? We are certainly fighting, right, as you know, for policy change. And I'm going to share a little bit about some of the policies that can actually help to redress segregation across the country. However, we should be clear that we're also fighting for money. for compensation, for access, for support, for opportunities, right, for people who have been harmed by these discriminatory housing systems. And so I want to share a little bit about a redress possibility model that is getting quite a bit of attention across the country. And this is a program that comes from the state of Washington. Some of you may be familiar with this, but if you're not, a bill was passed, the Covenant Home Ownership Account Act, in 2023, and it will set up a special purpose credit program through Washington's Housing Finance Agency. These will be interest-free down payment loans to anyone excluded from home ownership by racially restrictive covenants who lived in the state of Washington prior to the Fair Housing Act's passage in 1968, or the program will be open to anyone who is descended from someone who did live in the state prior to the Fair Housing Act's passage in 1968. So this is a lineage-based program that is designed to provide a benefit to people who were specifically denied those benefits when white Americans were able to receive them. This is the kind of thinking that we need to be moving forward with across the country. Now, in terms of policy examples and recommendations, and I do want to say about this slide, I'm guessing someone will ask about the Supreme Court decision and we can talk about that, but the reality is, right, is that the Supreme Court decision is not going to stop the work of the redress movement. You know, we didn't have any Supreme Court decisions that stopped the federal government from providing this benefit to white American families, right? And when the time comes, generations later, to provide a benefit to families of color, all of a sudden we're worried about racism and discrimination. The redress movement is going to continue to push forward in this fight to address and remediate the harms caused by residential segregation, and programs like this. Thank you. I want to note that there is support for programs like this in the law. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act actually does specifically authorize the passage of special purpose credit programs. So I do want to note that this is legal according to federal law. And I also want to be very clear that the Supreme Court's decision only applies to the use of race in college admissions. And so I'm not sure why anyone who wants to join this movement would preemptively decide that the Supreme Court's decision, which deals with college admissions, means that we can't work to ensure that benefits are provided to families who were initially denied them. And I would also submit that anyone who is taking that stance should think about whether they really actually wanted to join this movement in the first place. So when we think about policy-focused redress examples, there are lots. Here on the screen, here are lots of ideas about the ways in which policies can be implemented to address residential segregation. I'm not going to specifically call out some of these policies. I do want to direct you all, and that's just in the interest of time, to this resource. Just last week, the Redress Movement published a policy toolbox that examines community types across the country and shares a little bit about specific policies that can work to address segregation in those community types. There's also a very short, just 2 to 3 minute survey in the toolbox that anyone can take and then have a sense of the kind of community in which they live, and then link that to the actions and the policies that might be helpful to address in these. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here with you today. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions. If you do have a question, you can feel free to please step to the center mic. If you don't have a question, I will happily get down from here. Okay, I see we've got one coming.
We have a question from our online audience. It asks, it seems that these new mega property management firms raise their rents beyond the fair market rates for housing choice vouchers. Is there a way that can be addressed?
So I want to say with regard to vouchers, one thing that is important is source of income protections. Now I know there are 3 states across the country that preempt local jurisdictions from passing source of income protections, and the short explanation of what those protections are is just that source of income laws or ordinances make it so that landlords are not able to reject someone simply because they have a housing choice voucher. And so they're not able to decide they won't take vouchers. There are some states that have passed those protections and then a handful of municipalities across the country. I think when we're talking about setting rents and things like that, there are a couple of things to keep in mind. One, the housing authority can certainly use a tool called small area fair market rents, which sets the payment standard for a voucher at the zip code level for renting in that community, right? Very often what happens is that rents are set at a larger scale, a citywide rate, but then in the higher opportunity neighborhoods, the voucher payment standard isn't enough to pay for housing in that community. And so many housing authorities, and now HUD is even supporting as a best practice, right? Many housing authorities are choosing to set these small area fair market rents so that in neighborhoods that have more access to opportunity and in neighborhoods where rents are higher, the payment standard for the vouchers are raised. The last thing I want to say is that very often what we see in communities where source of income protections are passed is that property owners will then try to find new ways to exclude voucher holders, including things like asking for a very high credit score or requiring that voucher holders make 3 times of the rent amount. If you're seeing anything like that, if you're in a community where source of income protections are available, there's actually some litigation out of New York City that challenges, right, that 3 times the rent requirement. And the argument is that a voucher holder should only have to make 3 times their portion of the rent, because if they actually had enough income to make 3 times the rent of that apartment, they would not have a voucher. And so that's not legal. So I hope that speaks to the question, but we do have to be very clear that property owners are going to try to, right, continue very often to exclude voucher holders. And so we need to be moving forward with policies that actually address that happening. Yes. Yes. Oh, thank you for that question. So it's been 2 years that we've been operating, and about 2 years, yes, that Kevin has been doing this work in Denver. Kevin is over there. They haven't changed. What I'll say is that we're still in the process of doing a fuller review of HMDA data in the Denver community. We've done quite a bit of review of that data in Charlotte, where we're also working, and the numbers there are quite stark in that the denial rates for Black and Latinx folks are twice what they are for white prospective borrowers. And all across the country, the HMDA data continues to show that there are much bigger denial rates for borrowers of color than there are for white families. Yes. Exactly. Thank you. And I want to say thank you for that nuance, right? Because oftentimes when we have these conversations, what comes up is people start creating justifications. Well, oh, well, they just don't have the credit score, or well, they just didn't have, the income. We really seem to want to oftentimes believe that things are fair, right? But the reality is that the HMDA data, right, and the work that folks are doing when they call out these disparities, all of that is controlled for, right? So despite the credit worthiness, people of color are still being denied at these higher rates. So thank you for clarifying that. Thank you. Yes, and I think this might be the final question, yes, because we do have to move on to the other conversations.
Thank you, first of all, for speaking. I really enjoyed listening to you. My name is Ayana Session. I'm here with Colorado Access. And when I have these conversations about housing inequality and affordable housing, often the solution that is brought is that we are enforcing that most of the developments that are happening now have options for affordable housing. However, when I'm speaking to the community, this is not something that they feel is sustainable or that really is as supportive to them as it could be, because it is so difficult to get housing vouchers and to qualify for that affordable housing. What the community is telling me is that a lot of people would like to see caps on rent and things like that. And so what would you suggest as something that is sustainable policy that can be pushed forward to encourage caps on rent or things that would be more beneficial according to the community?
So I definitely think you're right that stronger protections are going to be critical as well. So things like, rent stabilization, for-cause eviction protections, right? There needs to be a requirement that landlords can't just refuse to renew a lease or can't just evict someone, right, without a good reason. So policies put in place that ensure that people can stay put once they are able to access housing is going to be critically important as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Thank you all so much.
Again, we want to thank and celebrate Cashauna Hill, ED. Why don't we just put our hands together one more time and just make her feel some love in this place. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.